The morning of January 13, 2024 in the affluent St. Louis suburb of Creve Coeur began with an incident that instantly transformed a local matter into a national headline. At 6:39 a.m., as the winter twilight just began to give way to the first light of day, a call was placed to emergency services. The caller reported the passing of his fiancée in their shared home on Conway Drive. The man's voice sounded steady, almost professional. That man was Robert Dow, a fire captain for Maryland Heights. Lying on the bedroom floor was 39-year-old Sarah Sweeney, a successful pediatrician. To a casual observer, it appeared to be a sudden domestic tragedy. But for the Missouri State Police, this call triggered a chilling sense of déjà vu. The reality was that exactly 3.5 years prior to that day, Robert Dow had made a nearly identical call. In July of 2020, he had reported the passing of another fiancée, Grace Holland, in the exact same manner. In both instances, these young women lost their lives suddenly while alone with Dow. And in both cases, they shared wedding plans and a life with him. The passing of Sarah Sweeney in 2024 instantly shattered the theory of a tragic coincidence. The statistical probability of the same individual having two consecutive partners lose their lives under strange circumstances before the age of 40 is nearly zero. Investigators arriving at Conway Drive found the body of the young woman with no visible signs of cruel behavior or a physical struggle. However, the context of her passing forced authorities to immediately label the case as suspicious. As medical examiners began the toxicology analysis for Sarah, the public and the relatives of the first woman, Grace Holland, demanded a return to the case files from 2020. It became evident to understand what occurred in the morning twilight of January 2024. It was necessary to examine the personality of the man who twice became the sole witness to the passing of his fiancées, to realize why the investigations regarding this man stalled for years. One must understand the scale of his family's influence in St. Louis County. Robert Dow is not merely a municipal employee. He is a representative of a first-tier dynasty of first responders. His father, Robert Dow, Sr., held the position of fire captain for many years, eventually passing the role down to his son. Robert's brother, David, served in the St. Louis Police Department, though his career ended in scandal and resignation following allegations of intimate assault with intent in the second degree. Despite this, the Dow name remains synonymous with reliability and power within the law enforcement community. The family also owned Liberty Artworks, a company that manufactured bronze memorials for police and fire departments across the nation. This provided Robert with not only financial stability but also personal friendships with the upper management of law enforcement agencies. In the eyes of the public, Robert Dow was a hero. But behind closed doors, that image changed radically. According to testimony from the family of his first fiancée, Grace Holland, he was prone to total control. This young woman, who held a degree in criminal justice and was raising 4 daughters, gradually lost her autonomy. After meeting him, Doss convinced her to leave her previous job and join his family business, but he arranged things so that Grace did not receive a paycheck directly. The funds were transferred to Robert's accounts, and he provided her with cash only for specific needs, controlling even what she spent on gas. He isolated the young woman from her friends, forbidding any meetings without his presence. This pathological need for dominance would later become a key theme in the analysis of his relationships with both women who lost their lives. Doss's influence in Creve Coeur was so deep that he openly told his partner, "My brothers in blue won't do anything to me. I've already taken care of that." And the events of the morning of July 22, 2020 became the first confirmation that those words might have been the truth. In the early morning hours of July 22, 2020, around 5 a.m., the silence on Fairway Circle was broken by a call to emergency services. Robert Dow informed the dispatcher that his fiancée, 35-year-old Grace Holland, had ended her own life by a gunshot to the head. Police arriving at the scene found the fire captain in a state of absolute calm. The young woman was lying in the bedroom of their old home from which they were planning to move to a new estate on Conway Drive. At first glance, the scene appeared obvious to the local officers who knew Dow personally, an act of self-harm stemming from depression. However, the initial examination of the body, conducted later by the medical examiner, revealed an anomaly that was impossible to ignore with an unbiased approach. The fatal wound was located in the area of the left temple. Grace Holland was right-handed. She had experience handling firearms, having completed a law enforcement program in school, and always used her right hand for shooting. For an individual who decided to end their own life using an awkward, non-dominant hand is an extremely atypical action. Furthermore, the physical placement of the wound dictated a specific trajectory that corresponded more closely to someone standing to her left. Despite this glaring contradiction, Creve Coeur investigators did not perform tests for gunshot residue on Grace's hands or Robert's. A strange detail was also recorded at the scene. A pool of blood was found on the right side of the head, even though the entry wound was on the left, which could indicate the body was moved after the shot. However, the investigation chose to trust the version of events provided by their colleague. Doss's claim that the young woman suffered from postpartum depression, allegedly due to a recent miscarriage, was taken as fact without any verification of medical records. Thus, the foundation of the investigation was laid solely on the words of the only witness whose testimony began to change almost immediately. Robert Dow's behavior on the day Grace Holland lost her life raised questions from the very first minute, reinforcing the doubts regarding the geometry of the shot. In the recording of the call to emergency services, you can clearly hear how a professional first responder, someone duty-bound to attempt resuscitation until the very last chance, doesn't even try to perform CPR. He declares the young woman's passing as settled fact, labeling the wound fatal, even though the dispatcher repeatedly urged him to provide medical aid. Later that same day, Dow gave his initial statements to patrol officers. He claimed he was in the living room when his fiancée came in, hugged him without saying a word, walked into the bedroom, and a moment later he heard a gunshot. This version painted a picture of a sudden impulsive act of self-harm while she was entirely alone. However, by the evening of July 22, after arriving at the police station with an attorney to provide an official statement, the fire captain radically changed the script. Now, according to the official report, he claimed he was in the bedroom with Grace. According to his new account, he was inside the tight space of the walk-in closet, sorting through their belongings. Dowse specified a critical detail. He was folding and carrying stacks of clean laundry, which meant his hands were occupied with clothes. In this version, the young woman approached him from the right and pressed her head against his face for a side hug. Robert insisted that because his hands were full of laundry, he couldn't fully hug her back. And most importantly, he failed to notice the handgun in her hands. The shot rang out literally a foot away from him at the very moment he began to turn away to continue his work. This shift in testimony was a calculated legal move. Doss, as a seasoned first responder, understood a crucial fact. Whenever a firearm is discharged, a cloud of microscopic particles known as gunshot residue is released, settling on the skin and clothing of whoever pulled the trigger. Had he stuck to his initial story that he was in a completely different room, the discovery of these particles on his hands would have practically branded him the perpetrator. However, by changing his story and claiming he was standing right next to Grace, Robert Dow essentially legalized that evidence. Now, any traces of residue on his person didn't look like proof of guilt, but rather the natural byproduct of being in close proximity to the person who fired the weapon. Consequently, the story about having his hands full of laundry was crafted to explain why he didn't intervene, and the new location served to justify the presence of discharged traces on his own clothing. Notably, during questioning, he couldn't provide a clear explanation as to why they were at the old house on Fairways Drive that day, especially since Grace had sent her sister a happy selfie from their new home on Conway Drive just hours earlier. Police failed to ask any follow-up questions regarding the reason for this strange change in location at 5 in the morning. During the same period, Dow admitted to being unfaithful to his fiancée multiple times. Yet, he maintained that their relationship was normal. This contradictory information didn't stop the investigation from closing the case. The official investigation into the passing of Grace Holland went down in regional history as an example of unprecedented negligence, what the family of the deceased called professional courtesy toward Robert Dow. The list of oversights was staggering. Detectives didn't arrive on the scene until 2 hours after the patrol officers, by which time the scene could have already been altered. The firearm was never processed for fingerprints or DNA, under the pretext that they both lived in the house, so their traces would be there anyway. Robert Dow's phone was never seized as evidence. Investigators allowed him to keep the device, accepting his explanation that he needed it for work. This deprived the investigation of the chance to examine The couple's real-time communication in the moments immediately preceding the tragedy. In this atmosphere of trust toward one of their own, police accepted another key piece of evidence from Dow. Self-harm notes supposedly written by Grace and addressed to him and her daughters. Despite the fact that the circumstances of her passing were extremely suspicious, the investigation failed to conduct a handwriting analysis to confirm the authorship of those letters. The most egregious fact was the disappearance of key evidence. The video recording of Dow's interrogation at the Creeker police station mysteriously vanished from the archives. Additionally, Grace's $20,000 engagement ring went missing. Her family insisted that the young woman never took it off. It was clearly documented in the initial photos of the scene, but it evaporated during the transport of the body to the morgue. Later, Dow lied to the police, claiming that Grace had returned the ring to him before she ended her own life, or that he had filed a claim with the insurance company regarding its loss. However, he never provided a single piece of documentation to back up his words. Even though old and fresh, bruises were found on the young woman's body during the autopsy, the pathologist failed to reflect any connection to potential domestic aggression, dismissing the marks as the result of accidents. Ignoring the protests of the victim's twin sister, Laura, and her parents, authorities officially closed the case. After just a few days, allowing Dow to return to his normal life, where a new figure would soon appear. While the police remained idle, Grace Holland's family began their own investigation, gathering digital evidence of the reality of her life with Robert Dow. Grace's social media painted a facade of the perfect family. Trips together, smiles, and wedding preparations. But the dark side was captured on hidden audio recordings that the young woman began making a month and a half before her passing. On one such recording from June 9, 2020, the true nature of their communication is heard. Dow screams at Grace using profanity and openly states that he hates her and her daughters. "I'll do everything to spend as little time with you as possible. Any delay at work, a flat tire, anything, just to not be around you." To her quiet words, "I love you," he repeatedly responds with orders to get out of his house. Evidence of physical aggression also took a documented form. In June of 2020, Grace confided in her sister that Robert had shoved her and dragged her through the hallway, leaving extensive bruising. The young woman photographed the injuries, fearing for her life. Her mother, Patricia, remembered hearing Dow's voice in the background during one heated argument over the phone. "Your cop friends won't do a thing to me. You're just a crazy girlfriend. Remember that?" Grace even tried to seek protection from Deputy Fire Chief Mark Russell, reporting Dow's aggressive behavior, but her plea was ignored. Robert skillfully crafted a reputation for Grace as a mentally unstable woman among his colleagues, laying the groundwork for the self-harm narrative. Grace's daughters later confirmed to investigators that Dow would fly into a rage over trifles, for instance, if a sofa touched the curtains or if silverware wasn't in its proper place. By July 2020, the tension in the home had reached a point of no return, as evidenced by the final cycle of their correspondence. Analysis of the text messages between Robert Dow and Grace Holland during the final week of her life reveals a classic cycle of abuse marked by sharp phases of devaluation followed by a facade of calm. In June, when the young woman learned she was pregnant, Daws's reaction was unmistakable. He repeatedly offered her $600 for a procedure to end the pregnancy, stating that he didn't want this new responsibility. By mid-July, his messages grew even more cruel. On July 16, he wrote, "I don't want to get married. I've told you this again and again. Get out of my life." Minutes later, he demanded she take her daughters and vacate the house immediately. Grace responded with her usual, "I love you. Stay safe at work." To which he bluntly replied, "Get lost." Yet, by the very next morning, Dow acted as if nothing had happened, suggesting they meet with friends and discussing furniture for their new home. This pendulum swinging from pure hatred to everyday domestic routine repeated daily. On July 19, he wrote again, "I want you gone. Your things need to be moved out." On July 20, the thought of you sleeping in this house makes me nauseous. That's how much I hate you. And that same evening, they were having a calm conversation about which bathroom faucets would be best. This level of instability in Dow's psyche kept Grace in a state of constant stress. The final selfie of the couple in bed, taken at 10 p.m. the night before her passing, shows Grace smiling, completely contradicting the logic of a planned act of self-harm. Only 7 hours passed between that peaceful image and the call to emergency services. Grace's family is convinced in those pre-dawn hours, something occurred that Dow couldn't control, and he decided to solve the problem exactly as he had promised, by leaning on his perceived untouchability. After the case regarding Grace Holland was officially closed as an act of self-harm, Robert Dow's behavior was far from what you would expect from a grieving fiancé. Not only did he fail to offer condolences to her parents, but he completely scrubbed Grace's 4 daughters from his life. These young ladies, who had lived under his roof for years and viewed him as a father figure, were suddenly locked out of their home and separated from their belongings. Dow's blocked all contact with the Holland family and barred them from participating in the funeral arrangements to the extent they were legally entitled. While Grace's relatives pleaded with the prosecutor's office for justice, the fire captain continued to advance in his career and build a new personal life. The family's only path toward accountability was a wrongful death civil suit filed in 2021. In this lawsuit, the Hollands' legal team laid out a mountain of evidence: the impossible trajectory of the projectile, the shifting testimony, the audio recordings of threats, and the vanishing evidence. They maintained that Dow had either pushed Grace to a breaking point or committed a crime and staged the scene. During these proceedings, it came to light that the notes supposedly left behind by Grace were of highly questionable origin. A handwriting expert hired by the family concluded that the writing style and phrasing did not match Grace at all. While this legal battle dragged on, Daw's found a replacement for his fiancée. His new partner was Sarah Sweeney, a talented physician from West Virginia, who had recently relocated to St. Louis. Sarah was young, successful, and driven. But she had no idea she was entering a home that had already served as the backdrop for a tragedy. The story began to repeat itself with chilling precision, including the isolation and the growing sense of dread. 39-year-old Sarah Sweeney did not fit the typical profile of a victim. A doctor of podiatry and a graduate of Barry University in Miami. She had opened her own practice in Creve Coeur and worked in an emergency department. That was where she first met Robert Dow in 2021. Before long, she moved into the estate on Conway Drive, the very home Grace once helped design. When Sarah's family learned about her partner's history and sent her articles detailing the passing of his first fiancé, she initially stood by Robert. However, by the end of 2021, Sarah's communication with her mother and stepfather had almost entirely stopped. She found herself in the same state of isolation as the woman who had lived there before her. The true reality of her life surfaced later through court records. In 2022, Sarah filed a lawsuit against her former employer, Best Foot Forward, alleging discrimination. In response, the company filed a counter suit claiming Sarah's mental state was unstable. A key piece of evidence was an email the young woman sent to a colleague in November 2022. In it, Sarah described her life as a nightmare. She had lost her savings, her car, and her insurance, forced to live with a man she explicitly called a terrifying perpetrator. I'm living with my perpetrator boyfriend, and it's very scary at times. I don't have a cent to my name. I've been through hell, Dr. Sweeney wrote. She also privately informed her boss that D showed physical aggression toward her and that she seriously feared he was involved in the passing of Grace Holland. Despite this paralyzing fear, Sarah was unable to leave due to her difficult financial situation and worsening health issues, which made her even more vulnerable to douse. The events of January 13, 2024 brought a tragic end to Sarah Sweeney's life, but opened a new chapter into the investigation of Robert Dow's activities. The young woman's body was found in their shared home in the early morning twilight. Upon initial inspection, police found no signs of a struggle or injuries similar to those Grace had sustained. However, the autopsy results and toxicology report presented a complicated picture. The cause of death was attributed to intoxication from a cocktail of medications, oxycodone, gabapentin, and dianhydramine. The official status of the cause of death was listed as undetermined. This meant that experts could not definitively state whether it was an intentional act to end her own life, an accidental overdose, or outside interference. The situation was complicated by Sarah's medical history. Since her youth, she had suffered from Perthes disease, and as an adult, she was diagnosed with mast cell activation syndrome. This rare condition causes severe allergic reactions, even anaphylactic shock, to ordinary triggers. Dawes's attorneys and Some experts suggested her passing could have been natural due to a flare-up of her condition. However, this did not explain the high concentration of oxycodone in her system. Sarah's family questioned how an experienced physician fully aware of drug interactions and her own diagnosis could make such a fatal error. And once again, just as in the case with Grace, Robert Dow was the only person in the house during the hours leading up to her passing. He again maintained an icy calm while reporting the loss of his second fiancée in 4 years, forcing St. Louis law enforcement to view the situation as a systemic pattern. If you look at the passing of Grace Holland and Sarah Sweeney in isolation, you could try to frame each one as a tragic accident or a personal crisis. But when you place these two cases side by side, a chilling pattern begins to emerge. In both instances, the victims were young, ambitious, and professionally accomplished women. Both fell into a state of total financial and psychological dependence on Robert Dow. In both scenarios, there was a clear isolation from family and friends. Both Grace and Sarah, shortly before they lost their lives, expressed to those around them their fear of Dow's and his aggressive behavior. Criminologists are familiar with the term offender adaptation. While the first incident involving Grace Holland was loud and raised a multitude of questions regarding ballistics, the second tragedy looks like an attempt to learn from past mistakes. Robert Dow knew that Sarah Sweeney was seriously ill. In this context, a passing involving medication becomes the perfect cover. It requires no staged struggle and is easily masked as a medical error or the tragic outcome of a chronic ailment. It is a shift from brute force to the calculated use of medical records. The passing of Sarah Sweeney in 2024 served as the catalyst that forced law enforcement to admit that the 2020 investigation was handled improperly. St. Louis authorities have officially announced a renewed interest in both cases, labeling them as suspicious. Public outcry and pressure from the attorneys for the Holland and Sweeney families have forced investigators to move beyond the inner circle of firefighter friends. Questions have surfaced about why Dow, a trained professional, pronounced his fiancés deceased both times before medics arrived and failed to render any aid. The similarity of the circumstances has become far too glaring to keep dismissing it all as a string of bad luck. As of now, in late 2025, Robert Dow remains a free man, despite both cases being flagged as suspicious. Official charges for the crime have not yet been filed. He continues to reside in St. Louis, though his reputation among the first responder community is shattered beyond repair. Grace Holland's family is refusing to back down, using the civil court system to push authorities toward an exhumation or a more exhaustive forensic review of the existing evidence. They are calling for the involvement of outside agencies such as the FBI, alleging that the local Kerr police may still maintain ties to the Dow family. The story of Grace and Sarah has become a grim reminder of how easily a man in uniform can manipulate a system designed to protect its citizens. The tragedy involving Sarah Sweeney has given the Holland family hope that Grace's passing will not be forgotten. The investigation continues and now. Every move Robert Dow makes is under intense public scrutiny. The question remains, how many more facts and digital footprints must be gathered to break the cycle of professional courtesy and finally answer what really happened in the morning twilight of July 2020 and January 2024. Until an arrest is made, the case remains open and the families of those lost continue to seek justice from a system that ignored them for far too long.